بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد اللهم كن بوليك الحجة الحسن صلاتك عليه وعلى في عالم الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا حافظا وباعدا ناصرا مدينا عينا حتى تسكن من أرضك أثرا وتمتع فيها تبين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليك يا الله السلام عليك يا رسول الله السلام عليك يا خيرة الله وابن خيرته السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين وابن سيد المرسلين السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة سيدة النساء السلام عليك يا ثار الله والنفاذ والمتر السلام عليك وعلى الأرواح التي أنفسنا عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت يا رب ومن عظمة الرسمية تجلب عظمة المصيبة بك علينا وعلى جميع السماء تجلب عظمة المصيبة فالسماوات على جميع السماوات فلعن الله من السسان صاص الظلم الجبر ولعن الله من دفعتكم أمراركم وزالتكم عن مراتبكم التي يعتبكم الله فيها ولعن الله ولعن الله الممثلين لهم بالتمكين من قتالكم فرجت إلى الله عليكم منهم ومن مشيارهم واتباعهم يا أبا عبد الله يا إني سلم لمن سالكم وحرب لنا محاربكم إلى يوم القيامة ولعن الله الأفياد والأبرار ولعن الله بني أمية وأوتاد ولعن الله الرجال ولعن الله عمر بن سعد ولعن الله شيعا ولعن الله أمة أسرجت الجنة وتنقب الرقاب فبي أنت أمرني فغنعظم مصائب فاسأل الله الذي يكرم وراءي ويكرمني بك أن يرفعني ذل ثارك مع إمام منصور من آل بيت محمد صلى الله عليه وآله اللهم اجعلني عندك وجيها بالحسين عليه السلام في الدنيا والآخرة يا أبا عبد الله يا أبا عبد الله إني يتقرب إلى الله وإلى رسوله وإلى أمير المؤمنين وإلى فاطمة وإلى الحسن وإلى إجابة الباطل وبالبراءة مما يراك عن سماك وبالبراءة مما أسس أساس الدنيا والجنة واكرم الله وإلى رسوله ممن أسس أساس ذلك وبنى عليه بنيانا وجرى في ظله جبري عليكم وعلى أشياءكم فرجع إلى الله عليكم منهم وتقرب إلى الله ثم إليكم بمبالاتكم ومبالاة نبيكم وبالبراءة من أعدائكم والناصبين لكم الهاد وبالبراءة من أشياعكم وأتباعكم إني سنقول لنا إنسانكم وحرقوا لنا ضالبكم وبني لنا ضالبكم وعدو لنا عاداكم فأسأل الله الذي أكرمني بمعرفتكم ومعرفة أولياءكم ورزقني البراءة من أعدائكم أن يجعلني لكم في الدنيا والآخرة وأن يثبتني علمكم ودرسا في الدنيا والآخرة وأسأله أن يبلغنا المقام المحمود لكم عند الله وأن يرزقني طلب ثاني مع إمام الهدى دور المعتدين من حق منكم وأسأل الله لكم وبالشأن الذي لكم عنا أن يؤتيني من صاحبكم أفضل ما يؤتي مصابا من مصيبة أدمان تعظم رزقته في الإسلام وفي جميع السماوات والأرض اللهم اجعلني في مقامي ممن تناله منه صلوات ورحمة ومغفرة اللهم اجعل أحياء محمد وآل محمد ومماتي ممات محمد وآل محمد اللهم إنا ظالم تبرك أبيبا وميا وبراك لك الأكبر الليل من الليل على لسانك اللسان صلى الله عليه وآله في كل مقتل ومعرف وعفاف نبي صلى الله عليه وآله اللهم لنبى سفيان المعاوية ويزيد بن معاوية عليهم منك اللعنة وبدلاهم بابا فنحني قال في آخر ربنا ببدر الإنسان صلوات الله عليه اللهم فضائل عليهم اللعنة منك ولا بعض اللهم إني أتغرب إليك في هذا اليوم وفي مغرب هذا وإيام حياتهم البراءة منهم واللعنة عليهم وبالمضاعفة على نبيك وعلى نبيك عليه السلام اللهم لا نقبل ظالمين حق محمد وآل محمد وآخر تابع على ظهره. اللهم لعن العصابة التي جعلت الحسين عليه السلام وشايعت وضايعت وتابعت اللهم لهم جميعا السلام عليك يا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي ألهت فنائك عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على المرسلين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام على المرسلين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. اللهم خص أنت رمضان ممن لا يدري وابدأ به أولا ثم الآن الثانية والثالثة والرابعة. اللهم لا يزيد خالصا ولعنه عند الله نزيانا ومرجانا وعمر بن سعد وشداد وآل أبي سفيان وآل زياد وآل أنوار إلى يوم القيامة. اللهم لك الحمد وأنت الشاكرين لك على مسالم الحمد لله على عظيم رزقيتي. اللهم ارزقني شفاعة السيد يوم الخلود وثبتني قدم الخير عندك مع الحسين وأصحاب الحسين الذين بذلوا أجرهم دون الحسين عليه السلام. محمد وآل محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. صلى الله على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We have some of our youth reciters who will present some surahs of the Quran. So please welcome Sister Zainab with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghayril maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Next we have Brother Kaysen and Sister Kisra. Please welcome them with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamualaikum everybody. Today, my name is Kisra, and today we are reciting Surah Ikhlas. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid walam yulad, lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Assalamualaikum everyone. My name is Lisa Mali and I'll be reciting Al-Quran. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum. La ta'khudhuhu sinatun wa la nawm. Lahu ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard. Man dhal ladhi yashfa'u indahu illa bi'idhnihi. Ya'lamu bayna aydihim wa ma khalfahum. ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض ولا يؤوده حفظهما وهو العلي العظيم.
Inshallah, we welcome our guest speaker, Sheikh Rizal, to begin the lecture. Please welcome him with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli.
صلى الله عليه وسلم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين، لا سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلق أجمعين. صلوات. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. يا أيها الناس قد جاءكم الرسول بالحق من ربكم فآمنوا خيرا لكم وإن تكفروا فإن لله ما في السماوات والأرض وكان الله عليما حكيما. Dear brothers and sisters, Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We began yesterday talking about the mission of Imam Hussein in relation to the message of the Prophet. He said that the mission of Imam Hussein was a continuation and an implementation of that same message, which revolves around haqq, around truth, and establishing and teaching the reality of God's creation. And we said that Imam Hussein's message implemented that teaching not only in terms of clarifying a message that had been lost only 50 years after the death of the Prophet, a message that had been muddled in all of the different issues that had arose for the Muslim Ummah. It's astonishing that within only a matter of 50 years, the very enemies of the Prophet, who had been enemies even before the coming of Islam, for Banu Hashim, Banu Umayyah, who were, despite being kin and family members with Banu Hashim, were always considered to be rivals with Banu Hashim. And these very individuals, this very clan, had become now the leaders of the Muslim Ummah. More importantly, they had also established certain values within the Muslim society. We see that in the letters that were sent to Imam Hussein, there are certain critiques and certain problems that are outlined for Imam Hussein, and Imam Hussein is called to come and rectify them. In some of these letters, it states that it is Muawiyah who has just passed. When these letters began to come, they were coming when Muawiyah had just passed and his son Yazid had been established as his successor. And so when these letters come to Imam Hussein, they list a set of grievances. They say that Muawiyah, for one, had attacked the Muslim Ummah and had stripped it of all of its blessings. It had taken all of that wealth that the Muslims were enjoying, and he had established certain individuals who were the lowest and the most evil and the most corrupt among the Muslims as the leaders of the Ummah. And for the good, those good individuals that had a high rank in terms of their spiritual and moral power, they had been either killed or they had been sent into exile. And so this list of grievances had come to the Imam, and more importantly, however, it states what the Kufans wanted from the Imam. It states that, may Allah bring you so that perhaps Allah through you and through your guidance will allow us to come back to that haqq and that huda, that truth and that guidance that Allah had established through his Prophet. So when we think about the mission of Imam Hussein, it is a recalling of the Muslim Ummah, which had lost its track, back to that same mission of haqq. There's certain values that were established within the Muslim society. If you think about what the Banu Umayyah had done, the worst crime that they had committed was establishing certain people as the most honorable and the most prestigious among the Muslims. And so that creates a certain set of values within the Muslims that they aspire to now. And what are these values? They are in terms of how much power, military, political, and social power you have, or how much wealth you can acquire for yourself, whether it is in a correct and just way or whether it is through corruption. The Ahlul Bayt and the message of the Ahlul Bayt was in the beginning of Islam and continued even after Karbala as an establishing of this important principle of haqq. And in fact, the Ahlul Bayt symbolized within Muslim society as the upholders of this haqq, of values of moral and spiritual force, despite being oppressed, despite being quieted, despite their voices and their bodies not being respected among Muslim society, they were always seen as the spiritual and moral force of that society. And it is, in fact, the very first claim for haq, very first claim of truth and of right that was made not just 50 years, right after the Prophet's death, was made by Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali himself. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Because we had started our conversation on this khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, khutbatul qasi'ah, let me take a moment to talk about an important term that Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, focuses on in this khutbah. He talks about this term al-asabiyya. Now, usually when we hear about asabiyya in Islamic history, we'll hear about a certain tribal solidarity that Arabs had amongst themselves. So for example, for those familiar with pre-Islamic Arabia, the primary focus and the primary affiliation that an individual had was in terms of his tribe. The source of political, social, financial, and any other sense of self that a person had was in terms of their tribe. So it determined, your tribe determined who you interacted with, who you transacted with, who you married, and what status you had in society. And so the tribe was the most important focal point for whatever identity an individual had. For those who were part of an important tribe, they felt a sense of pride in that tribe. For those who were either of a lower tribe or who were exiled from a tribe, they had this sense of inferiority in the face of others. So if we think about al-asabiyya, one way is to think about it in terms of this tribal solidarity, this tribal affiliation, which determined the way individuals interacted in that society. And in fact, in one of the stories, the backstories to this khutbatul qasi'ah, it is reported that in Kufa, during the final years or so, the final months or so of, thank you, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In the city of Kufa, in the final duration of the Khilafat of Imam Ali, this tribal affiliation and this asabiyya had come to the fore. All of those efforts that the Prophet had placed in remaking these affiliations for the Muslims come to the fore after the Prophet's death. In fact, even during the Prophet's life, a lot of this asabiyya, a lot of this tribal solidarity, tribal affiliation, this blind connection and this blind pride that people had with their tribe, even during the Prophet's life, it existed. Despite the Prophet trying to recreate a sense of identity for Muslims in terms of their connection with God, in terms of their service towards the truth and towards their Lord, despite all of that ukhuwah, that brotherhood and that fraternity that the Prophet tried to establish amongst the Muslims, these tribal affiliations still continued, even during the Prophet's time. But right after the Prophet's death, we see that in the case of Saqifa, the primary distinction is between the Aus and the Khazraj, or between the Ansar and the Muhajirun. These new tribal distinctions and the older distinctions. But when we come to the time of Amir al-Mu'mineen, this tribal affiliation, this asabiya, flares up again. Kufa, for those again who are familiar with Islamic history, Kufa was a garrison town. Initially, it was a camp, a military camp, that the Muslims would use to extend the Islamic conquests into the north and into the east. Right? As the Muslims were expanding and were conquering different lands, Kufa was that point in which they would try to launch those attacks. And so Kufa was also a town which was filled with different tribes. And each tribe had its own quarter. So if, say, I'm part of a tribe from Yemen, particular tribe in Yemen, then I will stay and I will live in a particular quarter. If I'm a different tribe from the Hijaz, I will stay in my own quarter. And so each of these tribes had their own place and their own status in Kufa. It is said in the backstory of this khutbah al-Qasi'ah that during that final duration of the Khilafat of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali sees that these tribal affiliations and these tribal wars, this tribal fight had begun to resurface again. And as the story goes, a person from one tribe, say the tribe of Kinda, who was one of the tribes that existed in Kufa, he would come into the quarter of another tribe, say a tribe of Nakha. And this person would start a fight. He would say something bad about the opposing tribe. And then the people of that opposing tribe would come in defense of the honor and the prestige of their tribe, because the most important connection that they had was to their tribe. They would come in defense, and then the people of the original person, that person who was instigating the fight, they would come in his defense, and these fights would begin. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, he goes to Kufa, and he sees this fighting, and he presents this khutbah. Now, what Amir al-Mu'mineen focuses on, and the way he uses asabiya is important for us. He doesn't just say asabiya is a social problem or even a political problem. He says that asabiya is ultimately a problem of the soul. It's a problem for each and every individual in terms of the values that that individual places for himself. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, he defines and describes asabiya in terms of a certain pride that a person has, a certain self-conceit and an arrogance that he has within himself and for himself. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen, he traces the roots of asabiya in terms of the action of shaitan. He says, تعصب عليه لأصله فعدو الله إمام المتعصبين والسلف المستكبرين. He says that shaitan, when he looks at Nabi Adam, he has this pride and this arrogance that he feels within himself because shaitan himself was created from fire, this entity that gives light, that has benefit, whereas Nabi Adam was created from clay, from dust. It has no real benefit. It is dark. And so he feels this sense of an importance, this arrogance within himself about his own origin. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen says, تَعَصَّبَ عَلَيْهِ لِأَصْلِهِ فَعَدُوُّ اللَّهِ إِمَامُ الْمُتَعَصِّبِينَ. And so he becomes the enemy of God and the leader of those who have this sense of arrogance and this sense of pride. وَسَلَفُ الْمُسْتَكْبِرِينَ. And he becomes the predecessor and the precursor to all of those who sense this conceit within themselves. الَّذِي وَضَعَ أَسَاسَ الْعَصَبِيَّةِ. The one who established the roots and the foundations of this tribal affiliation and this pride that we might have for ourselves. Now, Again, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, he describes Asabiyya not just as something that happens at one point in time in history. When he talks about Asabiyya, he talks about it as a illness and as a vice that affects all people throughout time. And so we have to think about ourselves as well. When we think about our own societies, what are the things that we take pride in terms of our own societies? Asabiyya, in fact, nowadays, in modern Arabic, is used for nationalism or even racialism. Despite those political and social connotations, we can think about, well, what are the things that our society takes pride in? Right? Is it, do I take pride in my connection and my affiliation to a particular country or a particular nation, despite and in spite of all of the atrocities that that country and that nation creates throughout the world? Or is it that I take pride in my wealth and my status in society? Or maybe I take pride in certain accomplishments that I have made. The message of the Ahlul Bayt is that Asabiyya for the self and for an individual is not in terms of the self, not in terms of my connections and my personal connections, or even certain accomplishments that I have made in the past. What we must take pride in and the value that we must have and we must uphold in our lives and in our societies must be aligned with the truth, with al-haq. And once you're able to realign that affiliation and that loyalty that you have in terms of the truth, then this affiliation becomes selfless. It doesn't become about who you are connected to or what status you might have. It becomes in terms of what is right and what is proper, what is just and what is true, and how a society must be run. And then it also becomes something that is creative, something that is hopeful, something that must be fostered. Al-haq, truth and justice in society, is not something that we can reach, and then once we have reached it, we can thank God and then move on with our lives. It's an ongoing process, something that must be implemented and must be worked towards. And so we see that in particular, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, talks about this working towards the truth. Not just in terms of the Prophet's lifetime. But again, Amir al-Mu'mineen was the first one to make this claim for the loss of a haq, the loss of that mission and that message of the Prophet after the Prophet's death. And so in another khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, Imam Ali says, فَوَاللَّهِ مَا زِلْتُ مَدْفُوعًا عَنْ حَقِّي مُسْتَأْثَرًا عَلَيَّ مُنْذُ قَبَضَ اللَّهُ نَبِيًّا. The Imam says that I, by God, continually and continuously have been removed from my right, my right has been taken away from me. And this has continued from the death of the Prophet until this very day. Now, when we think about Islamic history, again, we take our message and our values in terms of Islamic history and the values that Islam has placed for us. When we look at Islamic history, a lot of times we have to think about, well, what are the values that we point to? And what are the people that we aspire to become? And so when we look in books of Islamic history, we have to think about what is that narrative that we're telling ourselves. Now, just as a side note, for those who have taken a look at history books or at books of hadith, which also include history, a lot of times these books are a little bit difficult to navigate. So a lot of times you might if you're looking in a book of history, for example, you'll see a lot of disparate accounts. You'll see maybe one sentence that talks about one event, and then you'll see another sentence that gives you another report. Maybe it gives you a saying from the Prophet, maybe an action from the Prophet, action of the companion, and so on and so forth. But it seems like there are all these disparate accounts and disparate narratives that are given. And they all seem very short and very small. But whenever we're looking at these books, when we're trying to study these books, we always have to find that narrative and that thread that combines all of these disparate parts. And so, for example, if you're looking at a book of history, there are certain individuals that are highlighted, and certain values and certain accounts that are reported by the author, that are compiled and put together by the author, and they're placed in a particular order. In books of hadith, in particular, for example, if the book of hadith is about fiqh, say about the topic of salat, the author will compile a certain set of selection of hadith. And what he's trying to say with this selection is not just that, okay, these are reports that we have objectively acquired and that we have come together and put together in this book. No, what he's trying to say is that this is how you should pray. And we have all of these accounts, but this is the narrative that I'm trying to give you, and this is the requirement for your prayer. Or if it's about fasting, about zakat, any of the other aspects of fiqh. If it's about history, we have the same idea. You have to find that narrative and that thread that the author, the compiler, is trying to convey to us. And so when we look in books of hadith, and take one book in particular, there is a very important book called Al-Jami' al-Kabir, also called Sunan al-Tirmidhi. It's a book from outside of the school of the Ahlul Bayt. But what's important is that I want to highlight what are the individuals and the values that are highlighted in this book. In the last volume of this book, it talks about the fada'il and the virtues of the companions of the Prophet and the Prophet himself. When we study this section, we see that there are particular companions that are mentioned, and there are mentioned not, again, what's important is not just the individuals that are mentioned, but the values that those individuals carried and the virtues that are cited. So for example, one individual is called, say, the friend of the Prophet, Khalil, close friend of the Prophet. Another is called one of the Hawari of the Prophet, one of the close proximate friends and maybe even an apostle of the Prophet. In fact, this is said of Zubayr. It says, "Inna likulli nabiyyin hawariyan wa inna hawari az-Zubayr min awam." So it describes the virtue of this companion, whether, again, despite or regardless of whether these reports are true or false. Right? I'm trying to look at what's the narrative that we tell ourselves. What are the values that we uphold? It connects this companion, and primarily it connects whichever companion to the Prophet himself, and in terms of the character of that person or the actions of that person during the time of the Prophet. So for example, in another companion, it says that this companion gave all this charity during the time of the Prophet. And this charity will last this person even after the Prophet has died. The goodness and the blessings from this charity. This is despite the fact that most of these companions lived and survived past the Prophet's death. The point I'm trying to get at is if our ultimate value and our ultimate goal is to think about our connection to the truth and to al-haq, we have to think about truth and al-haq, not just something that we have accomplished in the past, but something that we are either aligned with now or we are not. The only individual whose name is associated with Haqq is Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam. In multiple ahadith, multiple different reports, there is this famous hadith of the Prophet. Aliyun ma'al haqq wal haqqu ma'aliyan. Yaduru haythu dar, or haythu ma dar. Ali is with the truth, and the truth is with Ali. Now, this second part, there's a few confusing points to this hadith. First issue is that, well, we know what it means for Ali to be with the truth. He was the first one to accept Islam, the message of the Prophet. He was the first one in every single battle, either to participate in that battle, or if the Prophet had commanded that there is something more important, to stay back. He was the first one to take up the banner of the Prophet. And so it makes sense for us, in terms of the Prophet's own life, to understand what it means for Ali to be with Haqq. But what does it exactly mean for Al-Haqq ma Ali? The second issue is, in the Arabic of this hadith, it's a little bit confusing. Yaduru haythu ma dar. The Arabic doesn't give any pronouns, right? Is it that Imam Ali is following Haqq wherever it goes? Or is it Haqq that is following Amir al-Mu'mineen wherever he goes? When we look in fact, in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, he elaborates and he kind of gives a different rendition of this hadith that is actually much more explicit. He says, the Prophet once said, قال رسول الله محمد المصطفى صلى الله عليه وسلم رحم الله عليا اللهم أدر الحق معه حيث ما دار. He says, the Prophet prays for Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, "O Allah, have mercy and have your compassion upon Ali. O Allah, make Haqq revolve and turn wherever Ali turns." One way of understanding this hadith is in terms of which individuals were either during the time of the Prophet or even after the Prophet aligned themselves with the truth. So in other reports, in other ahadith, we have that it is whoever loves Amir al-Mu'mineen is understood by the companions of the Prophet as being a mu'min, and whoever hated and despised Amir al-Mu'mineen was understood to be a munafiq. So Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, then becomes the determiner and the deciding factor between iman for particular individuals and nifaq. So if I wanted to understand and identify, almost like an identity card, if I wanted to know who is a true believer and who is not, then the companions, at least themselves, would look to those people who either loved or hated Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who would align themselves with Imam Ali. This is one way of understanding this hadith. Another way is by looking at Imam Ali's continuous encouragement and continuous call towards the Muslims and the Muslim Ummah at large to follow that truth that had been established by the Prophet and had been established within the Muslim Ummah that was quickly fading. So in one important event in the early history of Islam, we have the uprising against Uthman. Again, for those who are familiar, Uthman, at the end of his khilafat, because of all the corruption, and there was quite a bit, and all of the companions who had been rejected by the administration, and all of the different corruption and all of the cronies that had been placed into power by the Khalifa himself, and in response to the goading of his close family members, Imam Ali goes to Uthman. Now he goes to Uthman as an arbiter for all of the people who had stood up in protest against Uthman. This isn't a controversial point of history. There were protests from all across the Muslim lands, right? From Egypt to Kufa to various parts of the Islamic world. All of these people had come to Medina to state that all of this corruption has occurred and somebody must be held accountable. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen stands as an arbiter between these protesters and the Khalifa, saying that, now a lot of times you might try to reconcile this and say that maybe there were certain rumors that were spread against the Khalifa, or maybe certain of the individuals that were under the power of the Khalifa. But the fact that Amir al-Mu'mineen is standing as an arbiter indicates that many of these grievances were valid. And so Imam Ali goes to Uthman. In another khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, Imam Ali calls Uthman to follow that truth that he knows, that he himself knows. Imam Ali says, "Ma a'arifu shay'an tajhalu, wala adulluka ala amrin la ta'rifu." I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. I'm not going to guide you to anything that you don't already know. Sometimes the truth is absolutely clear. We just need to have the courage to stand up for the truth. وَصَحِبْتَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ كَمَا صَحِبْنَا صَلُّوا عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ. And then the Imam says, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ لِمَرْوَانَ سَيَّقَةٌ يَسُوقُكَ حَيْثُ شَاءَ. Don't allow these tribal affiliations, these family connections that you have with particular individuals, with Marwan in particular, for them to pull you in whichever direction you may have. Because despite your seniority and despite your previous accomplishments, you are still going to, if you continue down this path, and if you allow these people to misguide you and to take you away from that message, you are going to be led astray, and you're going to cause a lot of other people to cause even more corruption among the Muslims. And so, on one level, the mission and the message of the Ahlul Bayt is to encourage us, to give us the courage and the dedication to stand up for the truth. And so, when we see that the Prophet says, وَالْحَقُّ مَعَ عَلِيٍّ, it is in terms of this encouragement, this dedication. But a lot of times, it's really easy for us to say, okay, we're partisans and we're followers of the truth. And a lot of these kind of open and kind of empty statements can be made. But when we get down to the details, it's very difficult. Ultimately, even in our own society, it's very difficult for us to determine, okay, well, ultimately, which organization should I support? Or which group should I be a part of? Which group tells me is going to ultimately end in establishing justice, and which group is not? And so a lot of times, defining and determining the truth and determining the right course of action is very difficult. And we can, I think, appreciate that in our own lives, right? What and how should I act, say, for example, with my family? Should I establish certain principles that are unwavering, or should I be compassionate? Or, for example, how should I engage with my society? A society, a materialistic society that doesn't really accept a place, a true place for religion. How am I supposed to interact with this society? What would justice entail? Should I simply establish the name of religion and call myself a Muslim as an identity along all of the other identities that people might have? Say, for example, you are of this cultural background, you are of this racial background, and I am a Muslim. Is that the way we're supposed to approach our society, or are we supposed to approach it in a different way? So determining what that right course of action is always very difficult. Of course, having those principles will allow us to determine that. And one of those principles is to look at the actions and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. In fact, Amir al-Mu'mineen talks about this difficulty in another khutbah of Nahj al-Balagh, where he says, truth, if the truth were open and pure, then everybody would follow it. And if falsehood and evil were clear, then everybody would reject it. وَلَكِنْ يُؤْخَذُ مِنْ هَذَا ضِغْثٌ وَمِنْ هَذَا ضِغْثٌ فَيُمْزَجَانِ فَيُحْسَبَانِ. But a lot of times it's mixed. It takes a little bit of truth and a little bit of falsehood, and they get mixed up. And so we become a little bit confused. What is the right course of action in this case? But if we look at the principles and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, a lot of times they've established for us those very principles upon which we can establish our own lives. Because unfortunately, my time is already over. I'll just suffice at one of those teachings. In another hadith, in another khutbah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam, the Imam is asked, trying to think about how we should think and establish truth in our society, message of the Prophet in our own society. The Imam is asked, which one is better? Is compassion and generosity better, or is justice better? In our society, a lot of times we talk about love and compassion towards others. Right? Is it more important for us to have love and compassion and generosity towards others, whether it is on an individual level, on a family level, or on a social level? The Imam responds, Al-adlu yada'u al-umura mawadhi'aha wal-judu yukhrijuha min jihatiha. Justice sets things in their appropriate place. When you have justice, you're setting and establishing certain boundaries that nobody must step over. And so when you have justice, each place, each thing is set in its appropriate value, it's given its appropriate value, and it's not taken outside of that. And generosity does the exact opposite. It takes things out of their direction. And so, for example, if we're trying to be generous towards someone, we are generous towards people who a lot of times don't deserve it, or a lot of times have done something against us that maybe they are not worthy of that generosity. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen says, but don't disregard generosity. Don't disregard this Jude. He says, justice then, al-adlu sa'isun am, wal-judu aridun khas. Adl is a general method of action. It's a general manner of living. It's a general conduct. We must, in all cases, have established those particular lines and those particular methods and those places and those values that we have. And then we can have generosity once that justice has been established. Generosity is a particular intervention that we can make on an individual basis. This person has done an injustice to me. Once justice has been established, once the right place for certain things have been established, then I can look to forgiving that person. Once I haven't established the rules of interaction, then I can't forgive someone for breaking those rules. Even forgiveness doesn't make much sense when there are no rules to be broken. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali gives us this principle that we were unaware of, right? The Ahlul Bayt establish those principles, and then we follow those principles and we apply those principles in our own lives. And so the message of the Ahlul Bayt was always in terms of following that haqq, selflessly, not because of an affiliation that I have with a particular individual or a particular group, but because I am totally dedicated to the truth, whether it is in my favor or against it. And then it is to stand steadfast and to have courage to establish that truth, and that's justice. Now, when we look on the day of Ashura, when we think about all of the different events that could have happened, one particular person stands out. Once he finds out what that correct course of action was, that correct course of action was, this is a person who aligned himself with that path. Khur, he was the first person to stand in the way of Imam Hussein. It is said that, in fact, when Khur comes and meets the caravan of Imam Hussein, his whole party, the people who had come with Khur, all of those riding cavalry which had come with Khur, all of these horses and all of these men were thirsty and they were almost dying of thirst. And so Imam Hussein, he opens up the river ford, and he even, in fact, gives himself and his companions, give the horses and the men of Khur water to drink. Imam Hussein tries to bring Khur towards his camp and to try to show him the truth through kindness. When Imam Hussein tells Khur, what is it that you are doing? Why have you stopped us on our way to our final destination? Khur says, this has been a mission that has been given to me. Imam Hussein asks him, well, what about all of these letters that you Kufans had sent to me? And he says, that is not my concern. Imam Hussein then tells him, may your mother weep for you. On the one hand, Imam Hussein tries to show the truth and the right course of action in terms of kindness. And he tries to show the right course of action in terms of this curse. In whatever way Imam Hussein tried, Khur was completely shut off to the words of Imam Hussein. And it's not because Khur was not aware of who Imam Hussein was. When Imam Hussein says, ثَكَلَتْكَ أُمُّكِ, when may your mother weep and cry for you, Khur said, if it were any other person who had said this to me, I would respond in kind. But because I know who your mother was, I can't bring myself to say these words. Until the day of Ashura comes, and Khur goes to Muharram, and he says, after all of these days, what is your final mission? What is your final decision that you are going to make? When Khur hears the words of Umar ibn Sa'd, that there is no recourse for Imam Hussein other than their bodies being displayed on the plains of Karbala and their heads being chopped off, and all of these individuals being slaughtered and killed, Khur looks down to the ground and he starts, it is reported that Khur's body begins to shake. Umar ibn Sa'd looks to Khur. Other people who were in that gathering looked to Khur, this man of action, this man of any battle that had been had. He was the most courageous person, and yet they see that Khur has this fear and this almost terror that has taken him. And Khur responds when they ask him, what is it that has disturbed you so much, O Khur? He responds by saying, I see myself between the hellfire and the gardens. I see myself between right and wrong, between truth and evil. I finally understand. My eyes have been opened to the truth. And by God, I will never choose anything other than the happiness of God. Hur, in those final moments, had the courage to stand up, even though it was to his detriment, even though it brought harm, the ultimate harm to himself, and it is said also to his own son. Because his connection to the truth and to the message of Imam Hussein outweighed any other connection that he had in his own life. And so Hur, it is said, turns towards the camp of Imam Hussein. And he starts walking towards the camp of Imam Hussein, trying to figure out a way of asking Imam for forgiveness. In fact, it is said that when Hur arrived at the camp, we can only imagine the cries of the little children. And Hur knows that it is only because of him that the water had been cut off. It is only because of him that the caravans had alighted in this area. And so he must have heard the cries of the children. He must have heard their throats being thirsty for water. He must have heard their pleas to their father, to their uncle. And so when Hur comes to Imam Hussein, he says, "Oh Imam, I have finally figured out what I must do. But oh Imam, all of the sins that I have done, is there a way for those sins to be forgiven? Inni ta'ibun, I am repentant, O Imam. Is there a place for repentance for a person like me?" Hur had that courage. And so Imam Hussein looks to Hur and he says, "Yes, O Hur. At any point in your life when you want to align yourself with the message of the Prophet, with the message of Imam Hussein, there is always a place for forgiveness." And so Hur enters into the camp of Imam Hussein, but before he could take too many steps towards the camp, Hur says to the Imam, "Oh Imam, I cannot bear to hear these calls. I cannot bear to hear these cries. Oh Imam, can I be the first to give his life in your path?" The Imam allows him and gives him that permission, and so Hur turns towards the battlefield and he fights a brave and a courageous battle. And finally, when Hur is brought down from his horse and is struck a fatal blow, when he falls to the ground, he sees that Imam Hussein has come upon him. And he takes him in his arms. And Imam Hussein thanks him for his courage. Thanks him for his sacrifice. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Wa saya'lamu alladhina zalamu ayyama qalbin yanqalibun. Salawat.
luminous moonlight in the world, the rising sun, the light in the day, and then without you would be inclined. You're the heaven in Karbala, in Karbala. Your visitors offer you their hands, and you will never understand. How can the water lose to the sun? How can the earth run in Karbala? In Karbala, in Karbala. Heaven and earth and God the same. One angel descending, God the same. They are reciting in Karbala, in Karbala, in Karbala. Karbala, Behind the club and nurture the young, speaking for Allah, you were the tongue, separating his right from the wrong. Allah lived in Karbala, in Karbala, in Karbala. The ship that sailed swiftly to the west, and whoever board your ship is safe, immune from the punishments of the bird. Whoever knows you in Karbala, in Karbala, in Karbala. When will we meet again, Ya Hussein? When may your dawn breathe again? Najaf walk into Karbala, in Karbala, in Karbala. In Karbala, in Karbala.
Hare موج خراب عرش الله کنج خراب عرش الله خوش آمدی ای عزیز ما ای قرار من چشمم شده روشن سرت را بگذارم آهسته بم دامن ای قرار من چشمم شده روشن سرت را بگذارم آهسته بم دامن یا زبیح الله یا با عبدالله یا زبیح الله یا کردم نوازش با گریه نوبر کردم نوازش با گریه نوبر چیزی نمانده از ماه نوبر شکل هلالی دارم یک سالی بدون گوشوار گوشم شده خالی شکل هلالی دارم یک سالی بدون گوشوارش گوشم شده خالی یا زبیح الله یا گم شدم شب تابم بیام گم شدم شب تابم بیام گفتم یا زهرا با چشم گریان دیدم یک بانو دستش روی پهلو مرا بردی که باورم بازو دیدم یک بانو دستش روی پهلو مرا بردی که باورم بازو یا زبیح الله غسل من عشق چشامه کفنم پیرم سیامه به همه دیدم محشر ببینید حسین قامه غسل من عشق چشامه کفنم پیرم سیامه به همه دیدم محشر ببینید حسین قامه یا حسین عزیز یا حسین عزیز زهرا 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 بعد یه عمری تو دنیا که فقط قصد تو بودم شوره یا حسین زهرا تو لحد میشه تو بودم شیده ترکیم توی قبرم نام شاه عالمه کافران ایشالله تربت قبر حسینه مثل من عشق چشامه کفنم پیرت سیامه به همه میگم تو محشر بدونی حسین آقا یا حسین یا حسین عزیز یا حسین عزیز یا حسین عزیز یا حسین عزیز زهرا 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 وصیت کردم بابا روزی زینت نخونم وصیت کردم بابا روزی زینت نخونم تو شاید بابام بیارو تو سهر پیشم بمونم وقتی که نکی رو منکر رو به روی من میشینم عکس شش کوچه زدی رو به روی سینم میبینم سینم کبوده بخش تو ازم میگیرم جای پرسشای لبم بوسه از سینم میگیرم دوست من عشق چشامه کفنم میرم سیامه به همه میگم تو محشر بدونید حسین آقامه یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا بعد یه عمری تو دنیا بعد یه عمری تو دنیا که فقط دست تو بودم شوره یا حسین زهرا تو لب میشه سرودم ذکر کردی توی قلبم نام شاه عالمینه ذکر و کفرم ایشالله قربت قبر حسینه دوست من عشق چشامه کفنم پیرم سیاهه به همه میگم تو محشر بدونید حسین آقامه یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا یا حسین عزیز زهرا مظلوم شهید افشار مادر بیکس تنها یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا عبدالله یا من الزهراء یا من الطهار یا من الهدى یا من الحيدر يبكي متنهار درد الصحراء درد الآثار عيني كافر خوني معنا دلم ترسم بماند آرزوی کربلا تشنه ها به قرآن اگر کنونم بده نابگیرم در لحظت قبر شهید